Before we begin today's festivities here, we want to take a moment to recognize what's going on in the world, the alarming state of affairs that we are currently experiencing with executive orders and everything else going on in Washington, significantly impacting so many of us. We are mindful of those with heavy hearts who may be wrestling with a host of uncertainties. We do hope your time with us allows you to be fully present today as we gather to celebrate the remarkable stories and range of illustrious writers you have access to, along with the multiple ways you, if you are a writer, to grow your craft. This is a day we celebrate reading and writing and pave the way for those stories to give light to our future. We also like to acknowledge we are currently on the traditional lands of the Piscataway, Lumbee, and Eastern Band of Cherokee community members who have stewarded it throughout generations. We respectfully ask you to make this a more meaningful practice if you live in this region and consider learning more about Indigenous Baltimore. Join us in honoring and acknowledging the original inhabitants of the land we are on, as well as the enslaved people who built this country and structures that make up our modern North American landscape, paying respect to the past and present. Please understand, acknowledgement can be shown in simple ways, like learning about invasive and native plant and animal species and educating yourself on local tribal histories. My name is Brian Lyles. I am a board member and past board chair of City Lit Project, and I want to thank you for being here today at the 22nd Annual City Lit Festival. City Lit Project, in partnership with Lord Baltimore Hotel and Red Emma's, presents this year's festival theme based on the words of iconic poet Nikki Giovanni. Our stories give light to our future. We honor readers and writers in celebration of amplifying literature at a time when a record number of books by BIPOC and LGBTQI communities are banned from library shelves and public schools. Our festival showcases remarkable poets and writers we want you to know about. Over the past 21 years of incorporation, City Lit Project has grown and evolved with you. We've curated and cultivated a number of sessions over the years, like this one. So we're glad you're here today. Please, we ask that you silence your phones, but by all means, be sure to share what you're experiencing today in social media. City Lit is a small but fierce women and artist-led nonprofit that nurtures the diverse culture of literature in Baltimore and throughout Maryland with 5 signature events. This, the City Lit Festival, along with City Lit Stage, City Lit Studio, and A Home for the Heart to Live In, our poetry series featuring Kavikanam poets. That happens in December. Along with our work with Scribente Maternum, which is a fancy way of saying writing mamas, and our annual Write Like a Mother retreat. We create enthusiasm for literature, connect a community of avid readers and writers, and design opportunities for a broad audience to embrace the literary arts. You are all here as part of our vibrant community. We challenge you to tell a friend and to amplify literature and help us all build our creative network. Now it is my time to introduce our host for this session, Professor, activist, and writer, Diya Abdo. Diya is the Lincoln Financial Professor of English at Guilford College and the founding director of Every Campus A Refuge, ECAR. A second-generation Palestinian refugee born and raised in Jordan, Diya's work focuses on Arab women writers, Arab and Islamic feminisms, and refugee issues. Diya has published poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. Her book, American Refugee, True Stories of the Refugee Experience, was selected as a 2024 North Carolina Reads Book and was called, quote, a moving and timely book that strips away misleading politics to reveal the complexities of real human lives, in a Kirkus-starred review. We gratefully welcome her, and we are proud to have her here with us today to introduce this panel. So
Thank you.
Give me a warm welcome. Give a warm welcome to Diya.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. In the spirit of acknowledgement, and also because I found out that so many of us are connected to Quakers and, well, the Quakers on the right side of history, I'd like to take a moment of silence to also acknowledge our brothers and sisters in Gaza who are undergoing genocide and extermination, to hold them in the light, in solidarity, and in allyship. Thank you, friends. So we were sent instructions, and in the instructions it said, no small talk, which is great because I'm an introvert and I hate small talk. So we will begin by, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our fellow panelists, and then I'm going to ask each of them to talk about themselves a little bit more, to do a reading, and then we're going to have some questions. So to my left is Najla Said, who is coming to us today from New York. Najla is an actor, a writer, an author, a playwright, and a wonderful human being. We love having you with us today. Thank you. Sahar Mustafah is also an author, and she is joining us from Chicago today. Thank you for being here. And Issam Zineh is right here from Baltimore. He's also a writer. We all share Palestinian heritage, either born to Palestinian parents here in the US or elsewhere. And so that's going to be a big part of our conversation today. I myself, as was introduced to you, was born and raised in Jordan, and I've been in the US for a few years now. And this is my second time to Baltimore. And in the 2 times that I've been here, I've eaten in the same place. Mira Collective, which is an amazing restaurant. So if you haven't been, please go. I'd like to start with Sahar, if that's okay. Sahar, can you introduce yourself a little bit more fully? Tell us more about yourself, and we'd love to have a reading. Yeah.
I'm also a teacher, but it's so nice to save my voice with this mic. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Diya. And, thank you, City Lit. It's been so lovely being in this space. I got here early and was able to sit in on a few panels. I want to thank the audience too for sharing this space with us. I'm really excited to be among these luminaries. So I was actually born in Chicago to immigrant parents. In 1983 to 1988, I lived in the West Bank, and I actually went to a Quaker school. So there's my affiliation, Friends Girls School. The best time of my life, but we had to return when the first Intifada broke out. So we were just so heavily under curfew, and our schools closed down. We still have a place there. It's difficult to get back now, but as we say, inshallah. And I've been teaching for almost 28 years now. So I'm about maybe 4 years from retiring. So being a writer has been a wonderful second life, as I call it. It's so great to be able to cultivate this. Being the daughter of immigrants, there was no way I could have told my parents I was going to be a writer. So, going into education because I love to read and write seemed to be, the perfect thing. But that wasn't good enough because my dad was always one-upping, but you'll be a principal, right? No, Dad, that's where it stops. So I'm going to read from, this is my debut novel, The Beauty of Your Face. And just really quickly, it follows Afaf Rahman, who we meet in the present tense. She is the principal of an Islamic American school in a suburb, a fictionalized suburb of Chicago. And an unnamed white shooter enters the building. So he plans on basically conducting a mass murder. And we follow Afaf through the decades and get very close to her and how her parents ended up in Chicago. I'm going to read from right after 9/11. So this is February 2002 when Hajj, the pilgrimage, happened. This feels very fitting considering, what's been going on in terms of surveillance and kidnapping. So I hope, this strikes a chord. So Afaf and her husband and father are going to go to Hajj, which Afaf is very much against. They finalize their will and fax it to Majid. In case Afaf and Bilal don't return, Asma will take custody of her boys, and all of Afaf's material possessions will be liquidated into their trust fund, which Bilal carefully prepared. Her gold dowry from Bilal, among them a beautiful pair of bangles and a heart-shaped pendant and earring set, will be equally divided between her sons, her clothes given to the Noor Society of Sisters, her books to a local library. The old beloved record player will be shared, 6 months with Ayman, 6 months with Akram. Her brother Majid had long relinquished his rights to it, another relic discarded from his past. Instead, she offers him Mama's wedding band and a pair of gold earrings in the shape of almonds that she rarely wore. Bilal has his great-grandfather's gold pocket watch, curly cues carved onto its protective case. It's the only thing he'd managed to hold on to when his family fled the Balkans. This part had been easier than Afaf imagined, counting up what they owned, declaring its value, and dividing it up. But what about the things that really mattered? How do you stipulate them? There's no space in a will for how to raise her sons to be dignified and strong, or the number of times to hug them in a single day until they're finally able to pull away, or how to watch for the slightest trace of heartbreak or fear, no matter how much they'll try to disguise it, or how to treat all whom they love with respect and constant affection. Before Afaf, Bilal, and Baba head to O'Hare International Airport, they say goodbye to the boys at Esma's house. Her sister-in-law's children quickly steal her son's attention, and they squirm out of her arms to go play. The only tears shed are Afaf's. Esma hugs her tightly. Say prayers for my mother. My brother will take care of you and Abu Majid. Do not worry. Afaf nods, dabbing at her eyes with the sleeve of her overcoat. Asma and Bilal exchange 3 kisses on alternating cheeks, a tender gesture they share with their mother. He pulls his sister close for a long embrace. Allah be with you, Asma says, waving from the driveway. Snow crunches under the taxi's tires as they pull away, leaving behind naked maple trees and gray sky. In 20 hours, they'll be in a desert where the prophet once traveled to deliver his final sermon. An ancient place Afaf has only seen in books and on TV. The international terminal at O'Hare is a mix of citizens and foreigners, brown-skinned and blue-eyed, women in colorful saris under winter coats, men in patterned dashikis and hats. It's a blend of ethnic and Western fashions. There's a flock of Muslimin bidding tearful goodbyes to their adult children. Her heart lifts at the sight. She's been dreading the airport. It's comforting to see fellow pilgrims. As she passes them, Afaf catches white strangers staring at this display. Can they detect the notes of love ringing in the wishes and blessings these families exchange for a safe journey to Hajj? Or do they only see potential terrorists standing before them? They approach the security queue and a female officer waves Afaf over. You'll need to remove that. She points at Afaf's headscarf, and your coat. Afaf touches the zipper of her abaya, royal blue, tiny pearl beads on the hem and sleeves. Bilal steps forward. Miss, this is ridiculous. It's TSA policy. If you refuse to remove these articles of clothing, we'll need to search you in private, ma'am. Do you think she is concealing something under her scarf? Bilal says in a loud voice. People around them are suddenly more alert and skittish. Will this man attack us? Afaf can see the question furrowing in their brows. She squeezes Bilal's hand, placating him, wanting to end the quiet spectacle around them. It's fine. I'll see you on the other side, okay? Take care of my father. Don't worry, Habibti, Baba tells her. We'll be waiting for you. Afaf is led to a small area siphoned off by tall partitions. She hears the regular traffic of people on the other side, the loading of small bags and electronic devices on the conveyor belts, metal detector wands beeping. Please undress to your undergarments. Afaf strips down to her long slip. A beautiful woman stands across from her, her white cotton bra and half slip gleaming against her black skin. She looks over at Afaf, her eyes impassive. Afaf closes her eyes as another female officer waves a metal detector over her body. Her face flushes hot with humiliation, perspiration gathering between her breasts. This isn't like a visit to the doctor's office for her annual pap smear or crouching among the Muslimat at the communal washroom to perform wudu. She suddenly sees with the terror of being exposed. What if the partitions topple over? 100 strangers gawking and pointing at her partial nakedness. I'm going to be sick, Afaf tells the officer. The vomit heaves from her throat and she retches into a wastebasket someone quickly hands her. No reason to be nervous, ma'am, unless you've got something to hide, the officer says with a sneer. Afaf squeezes her eyes shut again as her stomach churns. When she can finally dress again and is permitted to fasten her hijab, Afaf is physically drained and a trickle of bile is tickling her throat. The officer leads her out of the makeshift room and she immediately spots Bilal and Baba. They wave and she catches more steely stares as Bilal hugs her. She bites her lip, refusing to cry. Are you all right? She nods, forces a smile. I need to use the restroom. She walks around, a custodian mopping the floor, and splashes cool water on her face. She catches a woman next to her staring at Afaf's reflection in the mirror, unsmiling. Afaf stares right back, defiant. The woman drops her eyes, lathering her hands noisily. When she passes behind Afaf, the woman flicks water at her headscarf. Shame on you, Afaf snaps back. What have I done to you? What has she done to any of them? Is she not a citizen of this country like them? How naive to believe she's ever really belonged with and without her hijab before and after a terrorist attack. You're all evil, bitch. The woman's awful words trail behind her like streaks from the custodian's dirty mop across the tiled floor. The other women quickly rinse their hands, herd their young children out, roll their luggage past Afaf, not looking her way. One snickers before closing her stall door. Afaf leans against the mirror, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. She wants to ask these strangers how she, one woman, a mother and wife, a teacher, if they'd only ask, can be a menace to them. How can she make them unafraid? She lets the tears roll. Are you all right, miss? An old white woman pats Afaf's shoulder. I'm fine. The woman turns on the faucet next to her. Human beings can be awful. She smiles kindly at Afaf in the mirror. Will this be life from now on? Afaf asks her. The woman is silent, gives Afaf a weak shrug, and dries her hands.
No, that's fine. And a perfect segue. This reminds me of two things. There's always that poem by Naomi Shihab Nye that makes the rounds of her at the airport being called to interpret for somebody, and then that moment of connection that allows us to see the humanity, right? And then today I flew through a couple of airports, and I thought many times about wearing my keffiyeh and forced myself to wear it. I usually have no question. I mean, it doesn't even occur to me that I can or can't. Today was different. So I'm going to ask you a question, Sahar, and then I'm going to open it to Issam and Najla. The excerpt that you read is very much about a dehumanizing experience, right? So how in your work do you grapple with what seems to be increasingly necessary to humanize Palestinians and also push back at the same time against the idea that we need to be humanized as if we were never human? How does this tension live and manifest in your work? And I think we saw a perfect example there, but I'd like you to talk a little bit more about how it either disrupts or perhaps expands your creative impulse.
I appreciate that. So this idea of humanizing means something completely different with the genocide in Gaza. So ask me when I was actually writing this book. For me, humanizing was more or less, how can I make the other more familiar, right? Because Palestinians have been so horribly, tragically dehumanized, I feel myself now pushing against this pressure, this obligation for us to humanize. And I've been thinking about it in quite a stark way, which I probably should have been anyways, but there's just so much internalized racism in me. For me, if I'm expected to humanize, that basically proposes that I'm of no value until I persuade other communities, right? And that has been a very, very, very painful reckoning for me. You talk about, for example, the not feeling safe with your kufiya. I didn't wear this until I got into my lift when I left the airport. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I can wear my watermelon earrings. And I thought, I just need to get here. I don't want to have to, let Susan Wa'adid, thank you for putting this panel together for us and letting Diya and Najla. And I saw him know I'm not going to be there because, I missed my flight. So it's been something I've been interrogating. The other thing that I find ironic about this obligation to humanize is that we're so heavily censored now. So it's like, how could I even tell my story if you're not going to allow me in the door? And Susan and I both have a close writer friend. She's a children's book writer, Safa, who she's on her book tour. She wrote a beautiful children's book, and the main school that has the most Arabs among their population, they canceled her. And they told her agent it's because Safa wrote about her relatives in Gaza who had been killed. So, and Safa's actually the closest to me who I know has a direct connection. My family lives in the West Bank. And even though, they are experiencing violence, it's nothing like what this friend Safa has experienced. So there's that contradiction, which just creates this really awful dissonance in my brain that has really impaired my writing. I'm coming back to it, and I'm excited. I'm back and I'm writing, but it's also made me think about, how do I shape the Palestinian cause? Is this solidarity when I write? Is this my resistance when I write? So in addition to having to think about, writing a really good story, right? Because I think about the hyphenated writer, and I think maybe Rita Dove said something about that, the amazing poet, about how there's this double burden, to represent, but then to also write well. So, we're kind of under the microscope with that, but I'm putting that burden down. I think I've always written for my immediate community, but the white gaze has always intruded. I feel like I'm sort of reconciling that. The other thing about the humanizing is it completely absolves our oppressors of their dehumanization, right? So it puts the burden on us instead of us turning, right, the lens onto them. And I think what has happened is we're in this moment because Palestinians, our literature, our art has not been normalized. We've normalized violence. We've normalized genocide. We've normalized oppression. And all those things have kept us, having to defend, our very existence. I think you said something, Najla, in a recent interview about just being born, and that being like, the crime. But I'll say this, I'll continue to write in order to, again, make my community as vivid and engaging, and hopefully it's a good story. So, I hope, you enjoyed what you read today. It's a painful story, but this is a family that is so nuanced. It's not your typical Muslim Palestinian family. They have all kinds of issues. Father's an alcoholic, mother has mental health issues. And, I was very cognizant of, okay, I'm putting this in the world. I have to make sure I cover all my bases. So there's again, right, that burden. I can hear that voice. But I also wrote it for folks who don't know anything about this book after the 2015 hate murders of 3 Muslim Americans in South Carolina, Yusora Abu Salha, her husband Diya, and her sister Rezan, who were killed in cold blood by their neighbor. And so I just sat with that for some time. I'm a teacher, so I feel like not that I would ever be used to it, but I have real nightmares about a young person bringing a gun to school. But this completely shattered me because this was an adult and it was because of bigotry. And I know these instances have happened and now we're seeing more of them. I come from an area that is only maybe about 40 minutes from the young boy, the Palestinian-American boy, Wahib, who was only 6, I believe, and was stabbed to death by a neighbor, so it's just very, very eerie. Who I tried to humanize in the book was actually the white shooter. So this is someone who when I was querying this manuscript, my agents loved Afaf's story, but they wanted me to drop him. They wanted me to drop the shooter framing. And I said, oh, no. The whole point is I wanted to convey, and again, I hope through a good story, what it's like to be Muslim and then to be visibly Muslim and to face threats every day. Sometimes it's verbal. Sometimes, it might escalate to physical. So that I think speaks to not paying attention to the dehumanizing, the whitening kind of forces, right? And what I'm expected to give up or to center because it's just not going to make, mainstream feel comfortable because they wanted a happy immigrant story and that kind of packaging. And I just couldn't go there.
Just in terms of the dehumanizing, I wrote my book in 2013 and it evolved out of a theater piece that I had been working on for about 10 years before that, or a little less than that. So definitely I wrote it at a time where I felt like my goal was to humanize us. And also because I felt like there were so many complexities in my own, like I don't fit anything of what you think of a stereotypical Arab. My family's not Muslim. I grew up in a specific way, in a specific class, in a specific environment with a father who was Palestinian, but was also a very well-known English literary critic. So it's all there was a lot that was very different. So for me, it was to make my family human and our people human. And interestingly, when I was writing it, every time I told a story about someone being racist or obnoxious to me, my editor and agents had to say to me, you're making these people not bad. You're apologizing for them constantly. And I was like, I don't want to say anything mean about anybody. I don't want to. And then interestingly, in the last year and a half, since I've been thinking about maybe writing about responding to the past year and a half, it's the opposite that I want to do, which is to not worry about dehumanizing myself and my family and really actually have the courage to say, this person said this to me and it was out of line. Because these things, when I was a kid, were more subtle, but now they're just outrageously blatant. They continue to happen. There's a lot of not your family. I know you don't hate Jews. A lot of that from people who call themselves liberals, leftists, whatever they think they are. So yeah, I think that it's a constant struggle because we do have to humanize ourselves to Americans in general and the West in general and Americans in particular. Because I'm sure others of us have experienced when, if you said, like, I know someone who was killed or something happened to them in Gaza or in Beirut or wherever it is, you're often met with a sort of, what did they do? As opposed to, that's not okay. So I think that it's a tricky dance because I think in the back of our heads, it's what we're constantly trying to do, but there's a resistance to it because in actuality, what we should be doing is showing how people don't treat us as humans as opposed to actively humanizing ourselves, if that makes sense.
Just a few words to add to these really articulate responses. The rehumanization or the humanization project happens not only on the page, but in real life in every encounter. So it's very overwhelming and exhausting. The other night we were having dinner with some friends who are probably not friends anymore with us because we got into an academic argument. Someone was trying to make the distinction between ethnic cleansing and genocide. Okay. I mean, that is a privileged place to sit. For me, it was problematic, not just because it didn't bother me that you were coming into a Palestinian household trying to have that argument. It was the fact that we were having that argument. We were on different planets. And so I've turned away from having those conversations in a way. And to Sahar's point, I think there's a kind of guilt that comes with that. There's a sort of abandonment. We grow up in the diaspora trying to advocate in every possible way to, show the stories, to show Palestinians as humans, as fully realized members of the species. I guess I'll say a couple of things about the writing briefly. Unceded Land was written over a period of about 20 years. It was just a collection of poems over time. And I was misguided at the time because I thought being more general in the work would actually be more universal. So I didn't mention explicitly things around Palestine. It wasn't until much later in the editing and putting the book together that there were some references. So this was an interesting revelation for myself, that I was thinking that generalizations would make things more universal, and somehow maybe that generates empathy. But in fact, it's the specificity around the situation in Palestine, or really any colonialized people, that's where you sort of get the recognition, and that's where you can generate that empathy. In my current writing, I find it very hard to even deal with this issue of humanization in poetry. The language of politics, in many ways, does the opposite of what the lyrical language does. And so I find nonfiction, which is something that I hadn't written until recently, I found nonfiction to be the way that I can more fully deal with issues of power and dehumanization and subjugation and resistance and possibly reconciliation. So that was also very interesting to see that it was actually a completely different genre that afforded me maybe the language or the form and the space to speak to those issues of humanization and beyond.
Mohammed El-Kurd, I'm sure people have probably gotten his book, or you're getting around to it. It's so important, the idea of the perfect victims. And he said, the Palestinian journalist, Shireen Abu Akla, nothing, she was like the perfect. She had an American passport. She was a journalist. She had, no criminal record. She was Christian, so all these pluses, right, to check off. And, there was no investigation, right? He said something interesting about, I just wanted them to mourn her without any qualifiers, and it didn't happen.
Thank you. I've just recently decided that I will no longer use the term pro-Palestinian because it assumes that one can be anti-Palestinian. So Issam, I'd like you to talk a little bit about yourself and read a little from your book.
Well, first I want to thank Susan again for bringing us together. Really honored to be here. And I've really had the privilege over the last couple of months to more deeply dive into the work of these brilliant writers on the dais here, and very, very humbled by the work and very moved. So thank you all as well. And thank you for being here. Being at a panel on Palestinian voices is not without risk these days. So I greatly appreciate the audience and City Lit as well. About me, I am born and raised up into my teenage years in California, Los Angeles, to Palestinian parents. We moved after the uprisings in response to the Rodney King verdict to the Northeast. And then I've lived up and down the East Coast. I've lived in Baltimore for about 17 years now. And probably what's important to know about that history is that all of the places I lived have very deep histories of colonial violence, whether it's, New England or LA or North Carolina or whatever it is. And that I think that politics of place and power informs my poetics. I was going to read from Unceded Land, but instead, a couple of short poems. Instead, I'm going to read something that's a little bit on the newer side. The voice is different. The voice is changing from the voice that was in Unceded Land, and I thought I'd share that with you. This is called Something Extraordinary Has Happened on This Dull Earth. Can you motivate me? Can I be motivated across my father's desert, which, though I cannot see it, must surely have capacities for blood. Once each year, when the Cape buffalo traverses the land toward the last remaining marsh, where the hunger of the pride awaits, has been waiting for weeks with its deprivation, my father has bled. My father has hungered. Your father has bled. Your father has hungered. He was once tied to an umbilical cord, once becoming as were the lioness and the muscle and the horn. Before we can speak, our neurons flame away the mists of the mountain, and there is a homecoming on the plain for the one or two black-red birds that have made their associations traveling atop the buffalo's back. Can you satiate me? Can I be sated? Even in the depictions, before I am killed by a wild boar, all my muscles relaxed by your hand, the dogs at ease, one of the dogs at ease, the fruit-laden table, dark grapes, blushing cherries, the lemon peel and pith, cloth-covered sex, decorum. What about the mosaic pavements and the entryways of the cosmopolitan elites before the Christ, the ones depicting beribboned parrots? A reckoning begins, counting space and numbering light. What is allowable by law? What the imagination, once unencumbered by dreams of farmland and notions of private property, could see in the rubbing of a little spit between 2 or 3 fingers? Can we say something about the earliest dream? A high likelihood we are swimming in it, that the amber light feels good. We make for mesmerizing creatures, an orgy of bees, and we make of suffering something enthralling. And here is where one might grumble about the we. I read legislatures as ligatures. I place on you this crown and this garland of flowers. I will take the credit and whatever blame for drawing this vulgar fig. Stay with me now. Breathe with me. The dream is not the only way in. It is a hot month, and the modern-day kings are cooling in their water holes, avoiding the self-annihilation required for the journey. In another part of the realm, we prepare for the winter ceremonies. We gather the stored bladders from seals we killed throughout the year, inflate them with our own breath, and return them to sea. Spark something for its smoke. Make your mouth make universal sounds. Look after your important buildings. Share the marble bones of your loved ones with whichever kingdoms of the world remain. What is that? Whose voice instructs, excavate? There are gold earrings in that tomb.
Thank you. So Issam, we're going to stay with you. So how is the voice changing? And how is that related to audience? Who's your audience? Audiences? What kind of relationship is there between who might engage with your work and who you might have in mind as you create your work?
Thank you. The voice is more oracular. It feels like this new voice that's coming out is up here talking into the ether, where the voice of Unceded Land. And when I talk about voice and audience, I'm talking about the speaker of these poems and the relationship between the speaker of the poems and the addressee, or the reader, if you like, which are often one and the same. And then that's a more direct and tangible audience in the work of Unceded Land. In that work, for example, there seems to be two audiences or two addressees. The first is the beloved, the perennial beloved in Arabic literature, right? And all the attendant issues that comes with that sort of around power and around intimacy. But then there's this other audience that, until recently I hadn't quite articulated who that is until I read this beautiful essay from Isabella Hamad. It was the Edward Said Memorial Lecture at a university that will not be named. That was, way too lucky to have Edward Said on faculty. And this was in September of 2023. She delivered it, and it's a book called Recognizing the Stranger, Palestine and Narrative. And she rightfully points out that many Palestinians spend their entire lives and careers trying to evoke epiphanies in other people. This is that idea of humanization, And she writes, and I put this down because I thought it was so brilliant. The destined audience for this persuasion is rather the unaffiliated onlooker, the foreigner, the one who had not yet reckoned with how much they are already historically, politically, economically involved in the lives of others. That's who the audience was for some of the more, let's say, legibly political poems in Unceded Land. This was the, if you like, the Western intellectual or the Western liberal or the liberal of the global North, however you want to say it. And that was the, I guess, audience that I was trying to induce a temperature change in, ideologically or imaginatively. I don't think my poems are interested in that at all. And this goes back to Sahar's point and Najla's point about, the exhaustion of the empathy question. I'm much more interested in what could happen in a situation like this. If we're sitting amongst ourselves, talking amongst ourselves, sharing our experience, and if there's that beneficial side effect of an epiphany in others as they're eavesdropping or sharing this space, that seems to be more of the mode that I'm operating in. And so there's not that direct didacticism in the work that's trying to formulate an argument and convince the reader of a specific position that they should care about Palestinians or about the subjugated more broadly. When I think about audience now in terms of process, I don't think about audience at all in the generative process, in the drafting. And less I think of audience in the revision process. I would say there are two important points where I think about audience. The first is for tone. What is the attitude of the speaker towards the reader? And is it appropriate for what I think the poem is trying to do? And the second is in depictions of violence. If I'm representing violence in the poem, I'm thinking about the audience and I'm thinking about the ethics of that representation. And not to say that I won't do it, but what am I trying to do? How am I trying to do it? And is it ethical? That's sort of where I am on the question of audience at the moment.
I think for me, so my book was, as I said, it grew out of a play, and the play it's telling my story, but it was part, as I said, I was part of an Arab American theater company, and we were trying to maybe insert ourselves or assert ourselves as a part of the American immigrant community, because there are Arabs who have been in this country for hundreds of years and all of that. So initially it was for a very specific audience, which was Americans, to understand my culture. And I thought I might be a good person to do it because my father, who's Edward Said, had written quite a bit about these subject matters in a very erudite and heady way, and using examples from literature and art. And I thought perhaps for Americans, a lot of people struggle with his academic work, that I could perhaps convey the same sort of ideas, but in a more accessible way and a more American way for a different generation and a different audience. So that was my original goal. But in writing it, I realized so many other things were happening. And then, of course, the book, sorry, I should say this. When I got the book contract, it was very specifically, we want you to write for young Arab American women. But I still had in the back of my mind that the audience was these Americans that don't understand these Americans, as if I'm not American. But so that was my initial audience. But I think in sort of, as I said in my earlier response, and just to sort of continue this idea, I think the voice is also evolving for me. I think I spent a great deal of time, as I said, trying not to make other people feel bad about how they've treated us or how comments that they said. And a good portion of my book is me trying not to offend Jewish people for an entire, like, over 30 years of my life, because I'm so scared that anything I say will get me in trouble. And now I feel that these certain people have not done me the same courtesy. And so this book my father died when I was 29, and this book and the play emerged in the years following his death. But in the years following the release of this book, much of what we've experienced in the last couple of years has occurred, plus some more. And I have felt very strongly that if this book was the Najla my father never knew, the 2.0 Najla who wasn't afraid of being who she was, then there's 3.0, which is me now, which is much less apologetic and much more angry, just to be very honest. You know, a lot of what's happening in Gaza is very personal, of course, but as was recently mentioned, my father was a professor at Columbia for 40 years. His office was in Hamilton Hall for 30 years. I grew up on that campus. So the betrayal and the anger and the hurt that I feel at this moment is on a level of, my mom's Lebanese, Lebanon was taken from her. My father's Palestinian, Palestine was taken from him, and Columbia was my home, and now that was taken from us. And that was the place where my father really made his life. So I think for me now, yeah, the voice is more of a, not necessarily accusatory and angry in a way that's just a rant, but I think a bit of a more constructive confrontation with the same people that I was trying to appeal to in the memoir.
Najla, we're going to stay with you.
Okay,
So if you
great.
can talk a little bit more about yourself and, of course, your book, and we'd love to hear
Sure.
some of your reading.
So I've already sort of said it. I grew up in New York City. My father was a professor at Columbia, and he was Palestinian. And for much of my childhood, he was probably the only person that was on television on the news talking about Palestine. Of course, let's acknowledge that now we have hundreds of people, which is a huge, important thing. So that's just in that you can see how things have changed just in my lifetime. But I had a difficult childhood. My parents were both from very highly educated families, and it was important for them for my brother and I to have a good education. And in New York City at the time, in the neighborhood in which I lived, the public schools were not good. And so my parents sent us to private school, which was interesting. There was a class sort of discrepancy, because although we were not certainly, we were certainly close to being, I guess, upper middle class. I went to school with rich people. I mean, and so I didn't fit in, but I had this background where my father had gone to 2 Ivy League schools. My mother had an MBA and was a banker and all these things. And we were Christian, in fact, Episcopalian. So I went to school trying to sort of fit in and find the things that were similar. And what I found was that something was wrong with me. I mean, I'm saying that in my child voice, of course. And so I began to write the memoir because during my lifetime, not only had I lived in New York among mostly Zionist Jewish people, but I'd also gone back and forth to Beirut, where my mom was from, been stuck in wars there twice, and had always come home and been sort of embarrassed. Instead of sharing what had happened or anything, I would just more and more pretend I wasn't Arab and try to hide. And I think one of the, Sahar alluded to in an interview I did the other day, and what's been interesting is when you see the comments that people write when I do interviews, they say, there's no way Edward Said's daughter couldn't have known where she was from. This is BS. But for me, my father had written this book called Orientalism, which had basically laid out how the East was just sort of a made up thing by Westerners. That's a very, 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 very simple description of his book. What I thought was interesting about my story was that I had those forces are so strong that I had, even though my father was the person that wrote the book calling this out, I had still internalized a lot of those things. With that in mind, I'm just going to read a little of the beginning. I am a Palestinian, Lebanese, American Christian woman, but I grew up as a Jew in New York City. I began my life, however, as a WASP. I was born in Boston to an Ivy League literature professor and his wife, baptized into the Episcopal Church at the age of 1, and at 5, sent to an all-girls private school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, one that boasts among its alumni such perfectly formed and well-groomed American blue bloods as the legendary Jacqueline Onassis. It was at that point that I realized that something was seriously wrong with me. With my green seersucker tunic, its matching bloomers worn underneath for gym and dance class, the white Peter Pan collar of my blouse, my wool knee socks, I was every bit the Chapin schoolgirl. I was proud of my new green blazer with its fancy school emblem and my elegant shoes from France. But even the most elaborate uniform could not protect against my instant awareness of my difference. I was a dark-haired rat in a sea of blonde perfection. I didn't live on the Upper East Side, where everyone else in my class seemed to live, but on the Upper West Side, or rather, so far beyond the boundaries of what was then considered the Upper West Side as to be unacceptable to many. I did not have a canopy bed, an uncluttered bedroom, and perfectly decorated living room on the way that my classmates did, or like the homes I saw on TV. I had books piled high on shelves and tables, pipes, pens, oriental rugs, painted walls, and strange house guests. I was surrounded at home not only by some of the Western world's greatest scholars and writers, Noam Chomsky, Lillian Hellman, Norman Mailer, Jacques Derrida, Susan Sontag, Joan Didion, but by the creme de la creme of the Palestinian resistance. I know that today there are probably lots of children of immigrants growing up similarly confused by the mixed messages of their lives, pertaining to everything from class to culture to standards of beauty. For me, though, growing up the daughter of a Lebanese mother and a prominent Palestinian thinker in New York City in the 1980s and 90s was confusing and unsettling. I constantly questioned everything about who I was and where I fit in the world, constantly judged my own worthiness and compared myself to others, and I struggled desperately to find a way to reconcile the beautiful, comforting, loving world of my home, culture, and family with the supposed barbaric and backward place in society others perceived it to be. I wondered why I was an exception to the rule of what both Arabs and Americans were supposed to be, and why I was stuck in such an uneasy position. After years of trying desperately to convince people that they didn't really understand me or the place the place my family came from, I stopped trying, especially since there was never anyone around me to make me feel less alone in my assertions. I resigned myself to believing that everything people said about my culture was true because it was exhausting and futile to try to convince anyone otherwise. Strangely, though, I also held on tightly to what I knew to be accurate and real about my family and culture. My parents and extended family are entirely responsible for that. I spent years simultaneously pushing them away and drawing them close until I found a place where I could exist together with them and completely apart from them. Letting go of the idea that I had to have one identity, one way to describe myself, one real me, hasn't left me any less confused about who I am, but it has certainly left me inspired, engaged, interested, complicated, and aware. And I'd rather be all of those things than just plain American or plain old Arab.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you this question, and I'd like Sahar and Issam to weigh in. What is it like being a Palestinian or a Palestinian-American writer or academic working right now?
This is an interesting question. So my solo play, on which this was based, ran off Broadway in New York for 9 sold-out weeks in 2010. After that, no theater wanted to. Usually when you do a play and it's successful, another theater will do it in another state or another nobody wanted to do my play. So I have made a living. I've made a living other ways, but on this story, I have mostly traveled around to colleges all over the country performing my solo show or doing book talks or combining them in some way. And I've probably went to like 5 or 10 colleges a year. At this point in time, I think I would not be invited. I don't think my play would be produced. And I am pretty sure in terms of like casting, in terms of my acting career, that was never like, it's a tough business, but it's definitely going to be worse now because I've been so outspoken. So what's amazing is that 15 years ago, there was this whole world open to me, and this felt like the time for this book. In fact, I didn't have a pub date at first, and then they pushed it to come out in 2014 when Gaza was bombed because they thought now's the time for this book. And I was like, here we go. Yes, my play, my book, and everything's moving forward. And then all of a sudden in 2023, we've taken all these steps backwards. And so on the one hand, there are more of our voices, but at the same time, there are still more people speaking for us than letting us speak. And we're more censored than ever. So I think that is an enormous difference and coupled with my who gives a shit, excuse my language, attitude now of not caring about protecting people from being offended. I think it's sort of funny because I think it's maybe going to be harder than ever at this point to have our voices heard.
So I probably have had maybe 3 to 4 events canceled. And one was immediately after October 7th. And that one hurt because it was actually in my school district. So it was the Park District that had started a book club. And because I'm a local teacher, reached out and said, we'd love to feature your book. And then, 2 weeks later, said they were having logistical issues. And when I kind of, professionally, politely challenged them and didn't hear back, so I know that there are those experiences. In terms of writing, my second novel has found a home, luckily, but it's with Interlink Publishing, which is thank you. It is a Palestinian family-owned press. And it feels like coming home. But, I won't pretend that it didn't sting, that even my publisher, Norton, dropped it. And this was after we thought I was going to be signing. So, and I'm such a pessimist, but, my agents were concerned again because this would have been, again, just maybe about 3 weeks after the genocide started. So it was on submission for, I would say then maybe almost a year. And it was so wonderful because Michel Mouchabek, who is the founder of Interlink, he had already published 2 chapters from this book for A View from Gaza, which Susan's work. I had offered 1 chapter and they're like, oh no, we need another. So can you please, which is so heartening, So this idea of, will we ever be heard again? Of course, but, and Lina Khalaf Tufaha, the amazing National Book award-winning poet, said, we have to think about where we want to send our stories. So where whose hands do we want to put them in? And it's a real changing, I think, of, this idea of mainstream, and all of the perks. I'm just being on this side of it now. I feel completely, changed, but I think for the better, for sure.
I don't know if you guys have been following Ta-Nehisi Coates' journey with this, but something he said to me personally was, I said, I know all you're doing is the right thing, and it's not a big thing when you just do something that is morally right for you, but to us it's huge, so I wanted to thank you. And he's like, I don't think you understand. He kept saying, everything I gave up is not like the community I've met, the people I've met, the world I have come to. Like, Oprah's not gonna fill that for me. Like, he was basically like, this is much more enriching of an environment and a world to me than being the darling of like the liberal elite. So I just want to give him props for that.
I want to say something about Norton. I was reading Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, And I was listening to it on audio and I was reading it at the same time. In the audio version, in the intro, she's talking about the region that now, like basically the Levant, which includes Palestine. And it says it in the audio among the list of countries that are listed. In the print version, there is no Palestine. So that says us everything we need to know about Norton and erasure. But the bigger point is that the literary community, institutions, I should say, have revealed themselves to be totally fraudulent, or Palestine has revealed them to be fraudulent. They have the oldest free speech organization in this country, has been completely corrupt. It's an arm of the state. The CEO was basically a State Department employee in years past, and they could not bring themselves to say anything about Palestine, even though among the 65,000 people killed in this genocide, a gross underestimate, by the way, you have culture workers, you have writers, you have teachers, you have librarians, you have artists of all kinds. The same is true of literary magazines. For me, that's also been very clarifying to Najla's point, with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Those that have remained and remained principled, it's a tremendous community of solidarity. So how that's impacted me, nothing so much in the writing. It's helped me think about where I would want to submit, what journals I would want to submit if they've signed on to PACB, the Academic and Cultural Boycott. That certainly catches my attention. If they've been vocal on Palestine in the right way, that catches my attention. So our work, our labor, I don't submit that to just any journal because it's been around and it's prestigious. At least I'm more selective about where I send my work out. The other thing I noticed is that there's a bit of a performance among some of these organizations where they're trying to do repair or through representation. They got it wrong on Palestine and they're trying to do right, but it's really about, let's just get a few Palestinians into the pages of our journals. But there are very few that have editors, Palestinian editors on their mastheads. Very, very few true meaningful interventions. This whole repair, and I'm borrowing this from my good friend and brilliant poet, George Abraham, who said representation does not equal repair. And, so who's doing the real work? The one other point I want to just raise, because I think I'm sure there are writers in the room, is this idea of, bearing witness. It has me thinking about this. Really, I'm an editor as well for a literary journal. And so I see a lot of well-intentioned writers that are trying to speak to the moment, whether it's Gaza or Ukraine or wherever. But it's a voyeurism. It's not a meaningful intervention. It's not a countervailing force against the really egregious insults, bodily and otherwise. So it raises a question for writers and artists, like who gets to write about what? And I believe, people should write about whatever they want to write about. But, how do you go from being a voyeur, which is not only not helpful, but can actually be harmful, to someone who is writing as a mode of intervention, social or political intervention?
Thank you. The space in which I find myself in is usually higher education, and just like any institution, most institutions are very problematic, but there are pockets, of course, And usually when I get invited, I send my headshot. I'm always wearing my kufiya, and I check afterwards to see, is that the headshot they're using? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes they found a picture of me where I'm 30, I'm almost 50. And I'm like, you would rather have a 30-year-old version of me than the actual version. But it is a very scary time to be a Palestinian writer, an activist. Recently, I was contacted by someone I didn't know, a professor, who's like, can you contact me? I have something important to tell you. And I was like, this has to be a scam or whatever. But it wasn't. Apparently, there's an online hate group called Mothers Against Campus Anti-Semitism that basically blasts, whenever there's a Palestinian writer that's showing up. I showed up on one of their whatever. And they're like, please show up at this talk. ask questions, but I don't know what that usually means. What is that code for? And then it was interesting that this is not an easy group to access. There's an informant in this group, which is how that information gets revealed. And in the comments, people were like, oh, isn't this the person who actually attacked a Jewish person in New York? Me, right? Like, what? Yeah. So just making up stories about us. And it was very scary. I alerted the organizers and they were very supportive, and I showed up, and it was a great event. But it's, this is the first time that I'm having to actually think about my physical safety in spaces. So we're going to end by telling you a little bit about me and do a quick reading. And thank you so much, Sam, for creating this event, and Carla, of course, I'm not sure if Carla is here, but for inviting us to be together in this wonderful community and bearing witness to each other's presence and being in solidarity with each other. So my name is Diya. I was born and raised in Jordan to refugee parents who were displaced in 1967. I studied at Yarmouk University almost at the same time as Shireen. That was really wonderful to have shared space with her. And I came to the U.S. as an international student. I was here during September 11th, and then I didn't want to be here anymore after September 11th. And I went back to Jordan, which was always the plan. When I was in Jordan, I was teaching at a very conservative institution. I published a piece on queer literature. They accused me of being anti-Islamic, and it was pretty terrible for a year. They asked me to resign my position. I was an assistant professor, and it took a year of bartering, negotiating with them. I wasn't, not sure what the word is. They finally rescinded their request for my resignation by that point, I was ready to leave that particular institution, and sadly felt like I had to leave Jordan. So I came to the U.S. and I've been in Greensboro, North Carolina ever since. I teach at a small Quaker school called Guilford College, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm a professor of English on the Lincoln Financial. I'm so sad that I'm named after a bank. That's the endowment. I'm an endowed professor. And I'm like, can we just call it the LF professorship instead of Lincoln Financial? But I'm a professor of English. And in 2015, I was watching, like I'm sure many of you, what was happening to Syrian refugees. And I'm sure it was reminding us of our parents' and grandparents' stories of being displaced from their homes. And I felt very desperate to do something. And so in a moment of clarity and I think simplicity, after hearing the Pope call on every parish in Europe to host a refugee family, I thought, wow, what if every college and university hosted a refugee family? And so I brought this to the president of Guilford College at the time, and I said, hey, can we use a house on our campus to host a refugee family? And she was like, sure. Only at a Quaker school would that ever happen. And we started hosting refugees on Guilford's campus in 2016. We've hosted nearly 100 people on our campus, and this effort has spread to many other campuses across the U.S., which have hosted hundreds of refugees and supported them in their resettlement. This book, American Refuge, is the story of my mother and grandmother and several refugees that we've hosted on Guilford's campus. And the cover art was actually designed by one of those refugees. He's a calligraphist from Iraq. And it's, of course, Lady Liberty with the word laji, or refugee, intertwined with her body. So I'm going to read a section from American Refuge. Refugees leave their souls behind and strike out on planes or cars or boats or foot. To cross borders they must cross to keep themselves and their children safe. Like a flock of birds, a school of fish, a dancing crowd, a mass of dead bodies, refugees are entangled in their perceived sameness. But they're all different. Their stories are different. And so are their experiences of persecution that have caused them to flee the homes that loved their souls, to solve the problem of death with exile. Anybody can become a refugee. Most refugees never imagined that this is who they would become. Indeed, my own family became refugees quite unexpectedly. In 1967, a week before the expansion of the Israeli occupation that displaced thousands of Palestinians, my mother, uncle, and grandmother went to join relatives who were visiting Jordan at the time. In 1967, 1 week before the Israeli incursion into Palestine, the distance between the White Mountain in Jordan and Al-Mukabbir Mountain in Palestine was less than an hour. An easy day's trip. Now it takes days. The travelers intercepted by checkpoints and bridges and roadblocks, and the Jordanian government and the Israeli occupation, But this was a week before the 67 incursion, when my grandmother took her children and decided to go for a short visit and never returned. Before Sabha, that's my grandmother, left Al-Mukabbir mountain and walked across the River Jordan, she decided to pass by her brother's house. They waved each other goodbye, she from the street, he from his front door. There was no need for elaborate farewells. This would be a short visit. As she walked away, she turned her head and jokingly sang to him, "My greetings and peace to you, O people of the occupied territories." Salami lakum, ya ahl al-watan al-muhtalla. This was a song they had heard frequently on the airwaves, Palestinians sending their love and support to kin who were separated from them in 1948. Their bodies unable to touch, they would send their souls in songs, lamentations, and impassioned, lengthy greetings that in occupied homes emanated from static-charged small black boxes. The kin would huddle around the radio, waiting for the sounds of an uncle or a cousin calling them out by name. "My greetings to my cousin Suha and Rana and Widad in Yafa, and my respect to my cousin Yasser and my uncle Amin languishing in Israeli prison." And so jokingly, she sang on her way out, "My greetings and peace to you, O people of the occupied territories." Little did she know that 1 week later, this song would invoke the truth, a persecution now expanded, and that her entire tribe, the family she left behind, would now be occupied. Little did she know that a week later, her nephew would have his intestines spill out in front of his mother and aunts, her sisters, when a cannon hit him in the stomach. They tried to put the intestines back in, scooping them with their frantic hands, but he still died. The aunts and uncles and cousins left behind in Jabal al-Mukabbir had heard such horrors of Israeli soldiers, and they all scattered in the mountains, fearing the rape and the murder that was to follow, hiding in the caves. They drank water with the livestock. Sabha and her children stayed as refugees in the camps of Jordan, unable to cross the border they had crossed a week before in 1 hour. It would take my mother 55 years to cross all the way back. The bird to its nest, the soul to its body, the spectral hand knocking on the doors, wondering who was still there, alive, behind them. When refugees become refugees, the pain of persecution, followed by the pain of fracture and departure, is often amplified by the burden of proof placed on refugees. To be recognized as a refugee eligible for support and resettlement in a third country, like the US, the fact of persecution is not enough. The phrase well-founded fear in the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees' definition of a refugee is a serious one that is taken very seriously. It means numerous interviews and interrogations by the local government of the country to which one has initially fled, then the UNHCR, then the Refugee Resettlement Agency, then the embassy of the country of resettlement, and then, if chosen to be resettled to the US, background checks by US Homeland Security. Every agency needs their interview, their interrogation, their pound of flesh. When I started working with refugees in 2016, I had not known about this particular requirement, the repeated screening interviews, which necessitate the repeated, unchanging, identical narration of the origin story of why one became a refugee. When we hosted our first Syrian family on Guilford College's campus, I went in those early days of our friendship to visit them, and I sat down for tea with the mother, Fehmi, in their spacious living room facing the woods. I had come casually in the way of Arabs, and I can't remember what I asked. It was a simple question, polite, harmless, something like, "How are you doing? Kif halik?" I know now that questions about one's being, when asked of a refugee, are never simple. Their experiences have taught them that such questions are a test upon which their very futures, their very safety, their very being depend. "How are you doing?" Fehmi's answer came quickly, easily, and at length. A perfect, flawless, rehearsed, and deeply painful and intimate origin story. The beautiful buildings in Homs, the plans for more levels on top for the other sons about to get married, and then the darkness, the neighbors slaughtered, including the toddlers and the infants, their throats slit, the fear that it was the other neighbors who had done it. She had recognized his voice under the mask when he came around that day, threatening. He used to come over for tea in the before days, unmasked and gunless. Then a gas canister exploded. She came out of the house and unthinkingly cursed Bashar. The neighbor heard her. She tried to cover up what she said, but she knew their days were numbered. The next day, 40 men came, masked, and threatened to kill her entire family. They tried to take her youngest son, Tamer, then 10, because they said he had been at a protest against Bashar. Under the cover of night, they gathered themselves, so many of them, and fled. Along the way, a very long journey, they were almost run off roads by highway bandits, hid in bombed-out buildings, nearly lost a baby, when in the chaos of an explosion, everybody scattered, and her daughter gave her granddaughter quickly to someone else. They found the baby the next day taken care of, but many other children, including her own siblings' children and grandchildren, were not so lucky. At the end of her recitation, she kept saying that while it was hard, they made it out with their honor intact. So many women had been raped. They had narrowly escaped and were so proud and grateful that they had. What we had tasted, no one had tasted, she told me. All refugees have lived lives that are distinct and individual, that are complicated and rich and layered. Something happens in their lives that fractures them from their souls, their homes, a fracture that threatens their safety. And it is a fracture they are not allowed to forget. Their future depends on forever remembering their persecution. So we're going to open it up now to the audience for Q&A. I think we have a little bit of time. I'm going to check my watch. See? Yep. Wonderful. Okay, great. We have 10 minutes or so. Any questions? Comments?
Were you talking about the one-way radio, by the way? Messages? Yes. Okay, that's I have that in my book. Only because I read an article about it. It was so heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
I'm not probably going to phrase this question the right way, but I always think about when your young self thinks about your older self, what would that letter look like right now?
That's a great question. I think it would be, I'd even write it to my younger self of 15 years ago or 10 years ago who wrote the book. It would be gentle and kind, but it would be very strong in terms of what I see in the younger me is someone who, and very much along the lines of what Sahar was talking about in terms of the Perfect Victims book, was always trying to make people like me. And I think that that's something that everyone can relate to. I also mentioned this interview that Sahar had watched, and there are some very nice comments underneath it, but there are like 4 nasty, nasty, nasty ones. And I used to function in a way that I thought everyone has to be okay with me. Everybody has to be okay with me because I can't handle if someone doesn't like me. And I think what I would tell my younger self is let people not like you. I think it's okay.
Really quickly, I think I would tell my younger self that they missed out on witnessing the incredible global solidarity that I wish my parents were alive, but I'm glad that they're not. Flip side. So never expected that.
There's a clip you can find online of James Baldwin, who is like a spiritual godfather for me, where he's being interviewed, and with an intensity, he's being asked, do you wish there was more humanity? Something about, do you wish there was more humanity in the world? And he says something like, there is not as much as I would like, but there's more than one would think. And he says, the world is held together by the love and passion of a very few people, and no one really wants to be free. This is what Baldwin says. So I would write that down on a Post-it and give it to my younger self, because it would save me a lot of energy to realize that I don't have to leverage the entire world. I just have to find and recognize that I need to be part of that small group of humanity that's working on behalf of everyone else. It's liberating.
Since we're talking about, sorry, I'm nervous asking this question. Since we're talking about the people of the diaspora here, Najla, when you say that, you were always trying to get people to like you, do you think that that's the American part of you?
That's a very good question. I do think so. I do think so. Yeah, I think I write also in the book very much about having had an eating disorder and being anorexic, which is some people don't at first understand if you don't know a lot about that sort of thing. Yes, it's a desire to want to be thin, but it was to me a desire to I had been isolated from the Middle East from the age of 8 to 18, and you know, we go on this trip to Palestine. It's my father's first time back. And I reject everything, including the food, which in that culture is really the most insulting thing you can do is not eat someone's food, because that's how we love. I think that when I think about that me, it was the American person who wanted to fit in and be thin and look white and all the things. But at the same time, there was something inherently Palestinian about it, which is like, acknowledge me, acknowledge my pain, acknowledge. So it was at once trying to disappear and at once trying to be noticed. And I think all of that is rooted in my Americanness.
So would the Palestinian feel this too? I mean, do you understand?
The Palestinian feel the need to be liked?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay.
No. I don't think anyone in Gaza is worrying about anyone liking them right now. So I wouldn't do that either.
Just to touch on a little bit about her first question, how does it feel like kind of living a double life as an American and Palestinian, especially when you're writing? And do you feel like you have to choose one life? And how does that feel like? How do you feel about picking that one story to tell over the other?
You know what? I don't choose. So for me personally, I had also done a lot of internalizing of racism and assimilation, which, is such a horrible failed experiment, because it's the kind of thing where you are asked, when you arrive with your bags, you're also asked to check and leave behind everything so that you could become part of this, American culture. I think I have a character, Nada, who's Afaf's sister, who she's struggling with assimilation during the 70s. And it's because her family has not found those spaces, either from the greater white society and then, just her own community. So, I would say that that's, for me personally, maybe not burdensome.
I think this is probably the most complicated question for a lot of Palestinian Americans. For me, I felt not one or the other, but both, sort of representing the American ideal. If you talk to Palestinians or immigrants, Diya's book is incredible. Their commitment to the American ideals is stronger than most, than the nativists, for sure. There's a commitment to that in that sense, but at the same time, you're still other. And I was very fortunate to go back to Palestine many times in my childhood and early adult life. So I got to meet my people and be exposed to the language, but I'm limited in the language. That's been the hard part for me. I'm conversational in it, but I can't express complexity in Arabic. I can't express political thought, creative thought in Arabic. So there is a bit of a ceiling effect in terms of being fully one or the other. That said, over the last 17 months, I decided to put on my big boy pants and do something about that, so I can learn Arabic, learn more Arabic, assert yourself in those ways. Don't compartmentalize one over the other. For example, at work, or in public spaces, you constantly navigating, code switching, all of that stuff. That's a project that really just started for me over the past year and a half. Is like, how do I become a full representation all the time, as opposed to a compartmentalized, disaggregated expression of one or the other.
It's also been really interesting to me after 9/11, up until 9/11, I should say, Arab Americans in this country are classified as Caucasian, white. I mean, if you're from Lebanon or Levant. So I think there was always this idea that you're supposed to somehow make yourself white in some weird way, especially because I'm Christian and all this. But what's been interesting since 9/11, I got this like minority Arab American thing stamped on me. And that was actually almost liberating because it allowed me to be these two things as opposed to trying to be as white as I could or trying to fit in. And then what came out of that and what has continued to come out of that in the last couple of years is that I consider myself a minority. So my friends, the people who have been there for me are Black friends, Latino friends, Indian friends, and so it's a bit of a shift into like, yes, I'm American, but I'm a minority American. I'm not going to be white, and there's no reason to try. And I think there's something that's been quite comforting in that, the hybridness of your identity, as opposed to trying to smush it into something that is American in some stereotypical way.
I didn't grow up in the U.S. I grew up in Jordan, but I never described myself as Jordanian or American. I always describe myself as Palestinian, which is, I think, maybe not unique to Palestinians in Jordan. It might also be Palestinian refugees who went to other Arab countries and just sort of imbibed from their parents and grandparents the importance of the Palestinian identity. And so we were always told that's what you are. You're Palestinian, right? That's and I am married to a non-Palestinian, and somehow that's also passed on to my daughters, and they also feel that they're Palestinian, even though I didn't try to sort of overtly do that. So it's really interesting, I think, in this moment too now, how people feel about themselves. But I think for me, it had a lot to do with growing up in Jordan under a grandmother who was always very clearly reminding me that we are Palestinian and we will return one day.
Yeah. Sorry, I keep having these. When I was growing up, when the PLO was sort of the main authority of the Palestinians, diaspora Palestinians and Palestinians in Palestine were one group. And because of the Oslo Accords and other divide and conquer techniques, we have now become West Bank Palestinians, 48 Palestinians, Gaza Palestinians, and diaspora Palestinians. And so I think it's actually more powerful, more important for us to assert we're Palestinians in the diaspora, because for us too, we are refugees. Some of us, like my grandfather, came here and happened to get American citizenship, so my dad and his sisters were able to leave. But regardless, just because someone came to a different country doesn't mean they're not still Palestinian and have nowhere else to go. So I think it's an important thing to maintain your connection to being Palestinian, because we are all one, and they've tried to make it so that we're not united. And so I think that that's important too.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Want to thank Diya and the panel here. We could talk forever about this. I will be escorting Diya and the panel to a writer's room. We have a setup of writer's room upstairs on the 19th floor, especially for writers who are interested in an informal discussion with these writers. We do have books available. The Ivy Bookshop is our managing bookseller on the first floor. So if you're interested in books, they are there. Also, these times are difficult for many nonprofits, so we don't know what's happening. I want you to, if you have a program, there are two things here, two QR codes to look at. We have a opportunity for you to donate to us through one QR code, so please consider us. And we also have a QR code for you to extend feedback to us. So we're always interested in hearing from you about what we're doing. So thank you again very much.